Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Again, thank you very much for joining our webinar in April, the 1st of April. As you can see, and you all know about geopolitics in 2026, power markets, and the new global order. So thank you very much for attending this. And we are delighted to have on this webinar, Alastair Newton, which is Chief Executive of Alavan Business Advisory Ltd. Alastair, it's a former career diplomat with the British Foreign Service between 1985 and 2005. And then he moved to the city and established himself as one of the private sector's top political analysts globally. Since 2015, Alastair has run his own business development and political risk consultancy, Alavan, and he's been based in Livingstone, Zambia. Additionally, his share of Paris-based Callis Partners and Lusaka-based 3030 Capital and CFO of Livingstone-based Diamond Development Company. In addition to his regular reports published by the macro research consultancy Theonomics and by Arab Digest, Alastair continues to publish his own Alavan independent brand and can be followed on his LinkedIn page. I've had and several of the ACI FMA members had the privilege to see and talk and meet Alastair in the various events over the future. So it's we're really delighted to have you here today with us, Alastair, and particularly on these troubled times for various reasons in the world. So I'll just hand over directly to you. Please let us know what you think about the current status of geopolitics in 2026. Thank you, Alastair.
Well, thank you very much indeed, really. And let me start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be speaking to the membership of the ACI FMA, a world-class organization and a rare privilege for me to be able to address your members. So thank you very much for inviting me, especially as there actually is quite a lot of geopolitics to talk about at the moment, as you may have noticed. So what I'd like to do is to start off with a bit of geopolitical theory, which I'll whip through very quickly. And then I'm going to look at a number of specific issues which are keeping me awake at night, and hopefully will be the same issues which are concerning those of you on the call today. What geopolitical theory tells us is that actually we shouldn't be at all surprised, big picture, by what's going on in the world today. It is exactly consistent, again, I stress big picture, with what history tells us we should expect at the end of a period of hegemony. And we are clearly at the end of the American period of hegemony. Now, hegemons are very good for the global economy. They remove barriers to trade, which expands, economies grow, and societies, though not all members equally, get richer. The corollary of that is that at the end of a period of hegemony, barriers of trade go up, economic growth slows or even goes into reverse. I suspect that all sounds rather familiar to you from experience over the last few years. Worse still, in the past millennium, 6 hegemonies have come to an end, and each of them has concluded with a war between the relatively declining power and a rising power, what American professor Graham Allison named as Thucydides' trap after the Greek philosopher general from, I think, the 4th century BC. Largely consistent with this, in the past couple of weeks, numerous commentators have described the Gulf War as America's Suez Crisis, the 1956 failed attempt by France, Israel, and the UK to wrest the Suez Canal from the control of Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt after it was nationalized. This is something I would actually dispute personally, but only because the US's relative decline, and I am talking about relative still, let's be clear about that, is a process rather than a single event. Now, what I'm going to say next is quite important for the context of everything we have seen over the last few years. If I were to point to a single event for when the process of America's relative decline was set in train, it would not be a war, but it would be the 11th of December 2001, which for those of you who may be scratching your head at the moment, is the date upon which China joined the World Trade Organization. For 2 decades thereafter, geopolitics largely followed economics, but this has now been flipped, and we are in a protracted period of economics and geoeconomics following geopolitics. That is a period which is going to last for some time to come. So much for the theory and the context. Clearly, if I'm going to look at events going on worldwide in terms of their relative importance, I'm going to start with what I'm going to term the Fourth Gulf War. Now, you may be wondering why I'm saying fourth when common terminology is third. I think it's very important that we remember that there was a Gulf War before the so-called First Gulf War, which was the Iran-Iraq War. And that's really important in the current context because it was that war which was hugely formative in the way in which Tehran views the world today. So let's stick to what the reality is, and we are in the fourth Gulf War of the last 45 years or so. I first sat down to consider what I was going to say about the war on Monday afternoon. I revised my notes on Tuesday morning in the light of events, and then I rewrote them pretty much completely this morning in the light of events which happened overnight in my time zone. If this webinar was taking place tomorrow, I suspect I would be rewriting again. In short, uncertainty persists, and please keep that in mind while I'm about to try to take a best guess at how events are going to unfold. Right now, it looks as if the regime in Tehran is on course to achieve its principal objective, i.e. simply surviving, probably coupled with its second objective of enhanced deterrence against possible future attacks. As Bridgewater's Ray Dalio wrote in a 16 March essay, which you can find on LinkedIn, incidentally, it's an excellent essay, I quote, "If Iran is left with control over who can pass through the Strait of Hormuz, or is even left with the power to negotiate, the United States will be judged to have lost the war and Iran will be judged to have won." End of quote. This being said, in the light of Donald Trump's statement yesterday that the US might withdraw within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I am not about to rule out the possibility of US boots on the ground in the interim, maybe more likely in the form of hit and run raids than seize and hold. But whether or not we see this, it does now look like the US will do as Donald Trump said he would do a couple of weeks ago and simply walk away, leaving others to sort out the mess he leaves behind. Beijing's mediation intervention in the past 24 hours will likely be helpful in this respect, clearing up the mess, that is, in that China does have some leverage in Tehran, as it demonstrated in 2023 when it brokered the resumption of diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh. Furthermore, Beijing, above all, needs a thriving global economy because of its economic dependence on export-led growth. Additionally, and finally, stepping in now helps Xi Jinping to continue to project himself globally as the one remaining adult in the room. Nevertheless, and keeping Israel and the war in Lebanon firmly in mind, as the Financial Times' Edward Luce wrote right at the start of the war, and again I quote, "Anyone who claims to know where this conflict is going will be bluffing." So, as I said, take everything I've said with a suitable degree of caution, given the uncertainties which surround us today. Final word on this for the time being, where will oil prices go? Donald Trump claimed yesterday that they will go down as soon as the US pulls out. Frankly, I'd call that a very bold assertion indeed, given the damage to energy-related infrastructure. And don't let's forget that it's not only oil and gas which is affected. Fertilizer, aluminium, including aluminium for canning foods, helium, I could go on. This is a much broader economic crisis than simply energy supplies, and it remains to be seen just what a damping effect this is going to have on global economic growth. Let's leave that there for the moment, and we can come back to it in questions and answers if you so wish. What I want to move on to is what might be viewed as being the biggest single crisis 3 or 4 months ago, but has in the last 5 weeks or so become perhaps a forgotten war. Russia and Ukraine, particularly relevant to our friends viewing from Europe. How much the oil price and the easing of sanctions is helping the Russian economy is very much open to question. It is clear that Russia is getting extra revenue from its oil, but exactly how much and how helpful it will be is far from clear. Russia can't simply turn the taps on just like that, particularly with a lot of the ground still frozen in its oil fields. What is clear, however, is the boost to Vladimir Putin's confidence. He is seeing the US visibly diminished through an excursion of choice, which some see as no more legitimate than his own special military operation. The parallels between the two grow ever starker, in my view, as the days pass. More prosaically, every missile the US and its allies use in the Gulf is potentially one fewer to defend Ukraine. Rightly or wrongly, and I still think the latter, Mr. Putin is almost certainly more confident now that he can snatch something he can dress up as victory. The probability that he will negotiate seriously is therefore even lower than it was on the 27th of February. And I note that yesterday, one of his spokespeople said that Ukraine should be negotiating for peace rather than a ceasefire. Another red herring, in my view, just confusing matters still further over a war which will likely drag on right through the rest of this year and possibly beyond. Again, moving on, I want to say a few words about something else which has blown up big time in the context of the amount of ordnance the US is using up in the Middle East, and that is the US, China, and Taiwan. I've already mentioned Xi Jinping and the extent to which he is personally benefiting from the war as being seen as one of the few, possibly the only grown-up left in the room. In many respects, China is the real beneficiary of the Gulf War. This despite the oil-related hits to its economy, for which it must be said, it has been much better prepared than the West has. Another quote for you, again from the Financial Times, Tej Parekh, writing on the 29th of March, open quotes, China could weather a conflict that lasts for several more months, while greater protection from global energy prices will make its exporters even more competitive, close quotes. And that's fundamentally something I agree with. Even before his words last night about wrapping up in the next 2 to 3 weeks, I was very confident that Donald Trump would want the Gulf War to be over one way or the other before his rearranged visit to Beijing in mid-May, when he will be desperate to strike a grand bargain of some sort with Xi Jinping. This may or may not happen. China's leader has been playing it long right from the start, and is clearly still in no real hurry to strike a bargain with Donald Trump, even though he would obviously like American tariffs on imports from China to be lifted. The question really is the price he will demand and what he can get Donald Trump to pay in return for the bargain. And I do think that one of the things he's going to be asking for is a de facto free hand over Taiwan. Now, clearly, I doubt very much that that will be explicit in any communique which issues from any meetings they have, either now or in the future. But ultimately, it has to be something which Xi Jinping is prepared to consider. And furthermore, I believe that it is something which Donald Trump would be prepared to concede. Indeed, for over a year now, I've been floating the idea that Donald Trump would quietly go along with this once the TSMC has established high-end fabrication plants in the US. And keep in mind, too, that Taiwanese domestic politics is tilting in the PRC's favor. This is something which Europe in particular needs to watch extremely closely. With its huge domestic investment in power generation, China, with TSMC in its grasp, could easily win the AI race. Indeed, some think it could even do it without the benefit of TSMC's advanced chips. This is sort of a silver lining in some respects. The depletion of the Gulf of US ordnance and in East Asia of US troops and materials has really set the alarm bells ringing over the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I simply don't think that this was going to happen in any case. I don't think Xi Jinping was remotely ready, and I do believe he would much prefer to take Taiwan over peacefully. We are now at the point where I think the probability of us entering into Thucydides' trap over Taiwan is in serious decline. That's not to say that Xi Jinping wouldn't invade Taiwan if he had to, but I don't think this is something we should be worrying about at this particular time. As for Xi Jinping's other goals, a close study of China's 15th five-year plan released early last month is well worth a read in my view. It confirms that his goals of self-sufficiency and control over new economic choke points as the rest of the world plays catch-up on strategic minerals. It also confirms that China remains wedded to supply-side stimuli, confirming what I said earlier about its dependence on its export-led economic growth. So please don't expect huge domestic stimuli or a shift of economic emphasis in China in the foreseeable future. I'm going to come back to China in a few minutes, but I can't really move on from talking about the US without a few reflections on the US and its relations with Europe. Donald Trump will see conceding Taiwan to the Chinese as part of a spheres of influence deal as he refocuses on the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, let me stress, not weakening China's ties in Latin America, on which most Latin American countries remain keen for economic reasons. Cuba may be next in Donald Trump's quest for a spectacle to distract US voters from domestic issues, but Greenland is by no means off his aspiration list. As if this and his failing to bring Russia to heel were not bad enough for Europe from Europe's perspective, a transatlantic trade war looks set to blow up again. The European Parliament may have ratified the Turnberry Accord, but it did so only on its own terms. And even yesterday, there were ructions going on between Europe and the US over trade. As Washington moves quickly to replace its IEEPA-based tariffs with measures which promise to be at least as egregious, it is very likely indeed, in my view, that we will see another transatlantic flare-up over trade in goods. Meanwhile, an even more dangerous dispute is sitting there waiting to blow up over the EU's Digital Services Act and taxes. And that's perhaps even more likely today, as I've been reading recently, that Donald Trump and Elon Musk have kissed and made up and are now good friends again. And we all know how influential Elon Musk can be with the president over issues which affect his own business interests. I was wrong about this last year, but surely Europe has learned lessons over the course of the last 12 months, and it is almost exactly 12 months since Liberation Day, first anniversary tomorrow. And I do believe that in the event of a major flare-up, this time the European Commission will be arguing with European Union member states that it should deploy its anti-coercion instrument, hitting US tech companies, US banks, and possibly even Hollywood. This would be a major escalation, at least on the face of it, but maybe we'd also be looking at yet another taco moment if the Europeans do stand firm and play hardball. And there is another potential silver lining here. I'd like you just to consider briefly the outcome of last week's Danish election, where the Social Democrats made a recovery, even if not a particular spectacular one. France's local elections, where the far right did not do as well as many had been predicting. And look too at looking ahead at I seldom talk about local elections to investors, but look ahead to the UK local elections coming up, and let's see how well Reform UK manages to do or not. The reality is that association with MAGA is hurting far-right parties across Europe. For sure, they still present a major electoral challenge, but maybe the threat which they pose has peaked, even as we talk today. I said I'd come back to China, and I'm going to do that in the context of Europe. There's been a lot of tough talk from the European Commission about relations with China, and certainly there is every reason to be cautious about China dumping of its exports into the European market and the damage which that is doing to the European economy. But there is a stark contrast between the language which emanates from Brussels, from the European Commission, and indeed, I might add, from the Council Secretariat, and the fact that Europe's leaders are queuing up, supplicant-like, in Beijing to meet Xi Jinping and to try to strike some sort of bilateral relationship, let me say, for the sake of this discussion with him. Yes, Europe does have a China problem, but it also needs China, and China knows it. With the US effectively abandoning the multilateral trading system, the rules-addicted Europe can only save what is left for it with the support of the world's biggest trading nation. I want to go back to what I said earlier about Xi Jinping entering into the Gulf War as a mediator and his interest in economic stability. China, above all, perhaps even more than the European Union, remains highly dependent on a rules-based international trading system. And working with Europe is really, really fundamental to China in this respect, because it knows very well that America is not going to continue to play by the rules. Now, I'm not advocating a revamping of the WTO or anything like that, because that would be remarkably difficult. But I do think that China and Europe have a big mutual interest here. And in particular, perhaps Europe, with the risk of continued Chinese dumping looming ever larger. I would stress that something I've been saying for quite a long time, and that is that I think for Europe to dust off the comprehensive agreement on investment, which it had drafted with the People's Republic of China, but which was shelved in 2020 over concerns in the European Parliament. I do really think this deal needs to be dusted off, needs to be revised, updated accordingly, and that especially with the chokehold which China still has on strategic minerals, it needs to be put into effect. Now, you may regard this as being pie in the sky, but everything I'm hearing from Brussels today is pointing very much in this direction. And it needs to, because what the Europeans need to remember is that China has escalation dominance over Europe in a trade dispute, just as it has escalation dominance over the US. Which takes me to my final points, which are about the US. I want to say a few words about the US midterms, because clearly there has been a lot written over the last few days about the impact which the war in the Gulf is likely to have on voter sentiment as we get closer to the midterms. And although they may still seem a long way away, 6 months or so off, keep in mind that the primary season in the US has already begun. And there will be MAGA candidates standing for the Republican Party in its primaries. And it remains to be seen whether they will be affected by the Gulf War and other factors or not. But it is a reality in America today that the Gulf War and indeed affordability, to which I will return, are having a significant impact on political sentiment across the board, as we are seeing in numerous elections which have been taking place over the course of the last few months, where even where Democrats have not necessarily been winning seats, they've been polling much more strongly than Democrats polled in those areas in the 2024 election. For now, at least, America First still appears to mean whatever Mr. Trump says it means, at least as far as the MAGA faithful are concerned. And that's roughly 35, 36% of the US electorate, so by no means negligible. Nevertheless, the Humpty Dumpty coalition, which gave him 52% of the popular vote in 2024, is broken, and it will not be put back together again. There are some very powerful voices who were strongly MAGA in the past, who have broken with Donald Trump, not only over the Gulf War, but also over broader concerns. And most of all, it is still the economy, stupid. Last week, the OECD put out, I wouldn't call it a forecast, it was more a sort of this could happen note, saying that inflation in the US this year could reach 4.2%. Gasoline, America's most electorally sensitive issue, is up by 1/3 already, averaging $4 a gallon across the country as a whole, and actually almost double that in parts of California. And keep an eye on diesel too, because diesel has gone up by even more than gasoline has. And the price of diesel feeds through into the price of pretty much anything which has to be delivered, not least putting groceries on the shelves of retailers. With no clear path to get this down, barring an export ban and price controls, Mr. Trump has a real problem, despite his brave words yesterday that as soon as America withdraws from the Gulf, the price of gasoline will come down. I think Iran may well have something to say about that. And his hope is, in my view, something of a pious one. So against that backdrop, let's consider the impact on the midterm elections. Now, I'm going to assume for the sake of this discussion that we see free and fair midterm elections, but that is by no means a given in my view. If we do see free and fair midterm elections, the Republicans will almost certainly lose their House majority, and their Senate majority is also at risk now. In the past few weeks, in the past few days, in fact, the poly market has declared the Senate elections to be a toss-up, 50-50. That's a 10 percentage point gain for the Democrats relative to where things stood before the 28th of February. Even with just a Democrat House majority to contend with, Donald Trump will find himself in trouble. He's already said publicly on more than one occasion that if the Democrats win control of the House, they will go after him. I think perhaps it would be politically unwise of them to do so rather than trying to concentrate on what Americans really care about, which is better governance, but that won't necessarily stop them. One way or the other, I doubt, though, that it will make very much difference to the way in which Donald Trump governs, which will continue to be largely by decree and, let me add, still largely backed up by the Supreme Court, despite its ruling on the Liberation Day tariffs. Meanwhile, the Heritage Foundation types in the White House, under the command of Donald Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller. Yes, I can see you raising your eyebrows at the thought of Stephen Miller. He is, in my view, Washington's most dangerous. The Heritage Foundation types will continue to do everything they can to try to ensure that it is one of their own who is sitting in the Oval Office on the 21st of January 2029, irrespective of the cost of that in terms of what they have to do to achieve that aim. Who will it be? J.D. Vance? Marco Rubio? I actually doubt. I don't think he's Trumpy enough. Maybe Nick Fuentes, another one of the most dangerous people in Washington. Young man, extreme white right-winger, for those of you who don't know it, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, thinks that women should have the vote taken off them. It all seems highly improbable. How improbable did we think it was that Donald Trump would be elected when we go back to 2015? Whoever it is, the MAGA faithful will fall in line. And in no time at all, as they have done with previous Republican presidents, even the sainted Ronald Reagan, certainly George W. Bush, they will be declaring that Donald Trump was simply not Republican enough, not MAGA enough in his case. Meanwhile, the rest of us may find ourselves looking back on the Donald Trump era and reckoning that it was not so bad after all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pause there to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Rui, back to you.
Thank you very much for that, Alastair. I always remember what you mentioned, that do not worry about Donald Trump, worry what's after next Donald Trump. So thank you for mentioning that as well. I'll open up for questions. Actually, we do have a question already on the Q&A. Coming back to something you mentioned at the beginning, actually on the chat, about the hashimony. Where can I read more on the hashimony? The one you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar?
Sorry, money?
The hashimony.
Hegemonies. Yeah.
Where can you read more about it?
Okay, there is an excellent book which was published in 2007, actually by a couple of economists called Findlay and O'Rourke, and it's called Power and Plenty, and it's a history of hegemonies over the course of the last millennium. Now, I picked up this book in 2007, just as it was published. It has been updated once since then, and I was fascinated by it. And it has been the basis of an awful lot of presentations I've given since, starting with a lecture I first gave at the NATO Defence College in Rome in April 2008. And I was a regular lecturer at the Defence College for some years thereafter. And the reason I picked it up and read it with such fascination, and actually used it as a cornerstone for that and subsequent lectures, is it does teach us an awful lot about where the world is today. And even in 2008, that was beginning to become apparent. And one of the slides I had at that lecture was a slide which said 11 September 2001 was not the day the world changed insofar as any single event ever changes the world. It was the 11th of December 2001, the day on which China joined the WTO, which is something I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Because the fact that we have moved from being a world where politics has been led by economics to a world in which economics is led by politics, and this is very key with Donald Trump, it's clearly a cornerstone of his thinking, is absolutely fundamental to the way we look at the world today. And that history of the last millennium fits very well with what Mark Twain never actually said, which is that history rhymes. That's not quite what he said. The quote from Twain, which is actually from one of his books, is a good deal longer than that. And what he said was the kaleidoscope of events throws up repeated patterns. And it's those patterns which we need to be looking for when we try to judge where the world is going to go from here. And we can detect the patterns from history echoing through time. And if we can see the patterns, we can then start to work out where the detail, where the devil actually lies, is likely to come out. And I think that's something which is really important for policymakers and investors alike. So Power and Plenty by Findlay and O'Rourke, published in 2007.
Power and Plenty. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that, Alastair. We have another question from Gerdian. Does it surprise you that Xi Jinping has not taken advantage of the current situation to move on Taiwan? Or does this speak to his only adult left in the room image?
I'm not at all surprised that he hasn't moved, to be honest. I think it has always been the case that Xi Jinping does not want to risk a war over Taiwan if he can possibly avoid it. He doesn't know where the Americans stand on this. Who does? I mean, Donald Trump is deeply unpredictable. He has made quite a lot of concessions on Taiwan over the course of the last year or so in his quest for a summit with Xi Jinping. He, on the other hand, has signed off on a congressional bill with, I think, $12 billion worth of military aid for Taiwan. So it's far from clear from his public nuances exactly where he's going to come down. Furthermore, keep in mind that Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready for a possible invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Now, it's not clear whether he means the 1st of January or the 31st of December, but clearly he does not mean the 1st of April 2026 when he says that. So I don't think that the context is appropriate to an invasion at this stage. I don't think that Xi Jinping is minded towards an invasion at this stage. I think what he is minded to is being ready to invade if he has to, which would require an event. For example, the ruling DPP to try formally to declare independence, which I don't think it is about to do. Indeed, as I said earlier, Taiwanese domestic politics is, if anything, moving towards better relations with China. The Kuomintang, the principal opposition party, has a majority with its supporting parties in the Taiwanese legislature, and it has been reaching out to Beijing, and Beijing will have a dialogue with the Kuomintang, if only to provoke the DPP and make a use of itself. So I think we are where we are. I don't think we need to worry particularly about Taiwan at the moment, but the reality remains a problem. In the meantime, I think if there are things in that part of the world which we should be worrying about militarily, it is China's acquisitiveness in the South China Sea, and also its relations with Japan and the dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, depending which you prefer to call them. There is always a risk of some sort of accident, a miscalculation, and a flare-up around those, just as there is around military exercises taking place around Taiwan. So don't lose sight of other potential flashpoints in the region.
Thank you very much for that.
Questions.
Exactly, there are more questions. Actually, there's some questions about Hungary, some questions about the Middle East, but I actually want to put one question on the EU, because by the order it arrived. With the EU planning to invest more than 260 billion euros in mining and manufacturing over the next 5 years, do you think this signals a move away from China and the US?
I do. I think that Greenland was a massive and belated wake-up call for Europe. I was particularly interested in the response from Berlin in particular, because if we consider how dependent Germany has been intellectually as well as substantively on the US for its defense since 1945, I think Friedrich Merz has taken, for all of his failings, faults, whatever way you want to look at it, I think Friedrich Merz has taken Germany a long way forward psychologically. And I would commend to you, unfortunately, I don't have the reference to hand, but if any of you are particularly interested, there is a really good interview on YouTube at the moment from the BBC with Germany's chief of staff, military chief of staff. A Swiss friend sent it to me yesterday. It's a BBC News interview. It is on YouTube, I think. I will try to find the reference and send it to you, Rui, so you can circulate it. It's fascinating. And although the Chief of Staff is extremely diplomatic on some issues, it actually gives a very clear indication of how mindset in a lot of Europe, not all of it, of course. You said you've got a question about Hungary in there for starters. Let's not forget our friend, Mr. Orban. The mindset in Europe has changed quite dramatically, and frustrating, galling, I think is probably the right word. It is for a Brit to say this. I guess in the end, we're kind of going to have to succeed that Charles de Gaulle was correct.
Good point.
Which takes us back to the Suez crisis, of course.
Yeah. Let's cover Hungary. Any opinion you have on the possible outcome of the vote in Hungary? Right-wing populism in Hungary dominated by Viktor Orban versus Magyar?
Well, the short answer is that I've not looked at this in detail yet, and I would be kind of reluctant to make a prediction in any case, because there were a lot of experts on Hungary who felt that Orban was going to be defeated last time around, and he wasn't. when I walk out of my front door, I look across the river and I see Zimbabwe, where my daughter is at school. And I do remember a few years ago when Robert Mugabe was still president of Zimbabwe, and he failed to rig an election properly. If you have as much power as Mugabe had, or indeed as Orban has over the media in Hungary, you have to be remarkably careless or incompetent not to be able to rig an election properly. So I'm not convinced that he is going to lose. But as I said, I've not been following this particularly closely. I think it would be a very good thing for cohesion of Europe as a whole if he were to lose. But I have to say that the other members of the European Union and the European Commission have been remarkably inventive at getting around the Hungary problem.
Thank you. Let's go to the Middle East. Could US afford to leave the Middle East with its vast resources and the Iran and China influence?
The short answer to that is that the US would be better not abandoning the Middle East. But this is Donald Trump we're talking about. And if he decides that America is going to stand firm in the Middle East alongside its allies there, it will probably have far more to do with America first and Trump and his cronies first than it will do with guaranteeing security in the Middle East. I'm going to be very interested to see where exactly the Gulf states come down on their relations with the US when the dust actually settles. For starters, I would not be at all surprised if some of the, even before all this, some of the somewhat tenuous investment promises they made for pouring billions of dollars into the US, I'd be very surprised if they didn't pull back on that in order to pay for their own reconstruction where damage has been inflicted by Iranian missiles and drones. I would be not at all surprised if serious thought were to be given by GCC members to more coordination on defense. Iran has done the remarkable, has achieved the remarkable feat of causing the actually non-negligible differences which had erupted over the past couple of years between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. Iran has caused those to be papered over for the time being at least. And it has given the GCC countries a good deal more common cause. And I think the message is clear. They cannot depend on the US at the end of the day any more than the Europeans can. The US, at least as long as Donald Trump is in the White House and probably thereafter, is always going to put Israel first when it comes to the Middle East.
Thank you, Alastair. In your view, what changed in perception from a weak dollar in Liberation Day versus a very strong dollar in US-Iran war? Is this related to the shift to politics running the global economy?
I'm interested that you referred to a very strong dollar. I have half read the Financial Times unhedged column today, which I get as a newsletter. Actually, I've not had time to finish it, but I rather like that newsletter. The dollar rally since the start of the Gulf War has been something like 2.5%, I believe. If you go back to, I can't remember the example which was quoted, but I think it might have been the start of the Iraq War in 2003 and the start of the global financial crisis in 2008, the dollar rally was considerably stronger. And I'm not a currency expert, so I'm going to be cautious about what I say, but I don't think the dollar has performed particularly strongly as a safe haven over the last 5 weeks. And everything I'm reading is suggesting that investors have been at best in two minds, and that I've even heard it said by investors, fund managers I talk to, that the rally has been driven in part by expiring short positions. So let's wait and see what happens in the next few weeks before we start drawing any firm conclusions about the impact of this war on the dollar. And I certainly would suggest to anybody interested in this, reading that today's Unhedged column. You'll agree with it or you won't agree with it, because the two principal authors of that do not agree between the two of themselves about longer term dollar prospects, which is always interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll come back to that as a dollar as a reserve currency. We have a question there, but let's just cover them by order of arrival. Is it only a matter of time when China try to take over Taiwan? If by 2027, as you said, is there a risk that China-Russian alliance will be at risk, as China may take over East Siberia in order to secure natural resources?
Okay. Well, let me deal with the second question.
I see your smile there.
Back in 2001, a very, very smart economist with whom I was working at the time, Rob Subbaraman, who's now chief global economist with Nomura. Then he was a junior economist for Lehman Brothers in Tokyo. Rob Subbaraman and I spent the better part of a year in China, writing a study looking forward to China's next 10 years. And one of the things we discovered was at that time, there were 2 million Chinese working in Eastern Russia. All of them engaged in extracting natural resources. I would say that China took over Eastern Russia a long time ago, de facto. And I have said quite a few times since the start of the Ukraine war, but I'm going to say it again. Vladimir Putin is looking in completely the wrong direction when it comes to threats. He should be much more worried about China, not militarily, but just in terms of its acquisition of natural resources in Eastern Russia than he is about what he perceives as being a threat from NATO. I don't believe there is a threat from NATO to Russia, though I do understand, I'm not going to go into a long history lesson here, I do understand to some extent why Putin believes what he believes. And I think there are some good but incorrect reasons for that. A discussion for another day. So yeah, I think China will continue to control natural resources in Eastern Russia to a very significant extent and to a growing extent, because in effect, what the Ukraine war has done is it is turning Russia into a Chinese vassal state. On the question of Taiwan, I think to a large extent, I've already answered that. I think, yes, this is a high priority. Xi Jinping will not believe that he has fulfilled his mission unless or until reunification has taken place. And as far as he's concerned, it is something he will definitely want to do and will achieve one way or the other before he finally leaves office. But I don't think there's any doubt that he's fully intending on serving a 4th term. So I repeat what I said earlier, I don't think we need to worry about this at this stage.
Thank you, Alastair. Provided that the wars are not won on battlefields, but in factories, can you please elaborate on Iran's resilience, supply chain, and capacity to conduct an attrition war against the US?
I think it's not what you produce, it's how much pain you're prepared to suffer. And again, I would go back to what I said earlier on about the importance of the Iraq war. Now, the Iran-Iraq war is something which the West doesn't think about a lot. The Iraqis actually presented the Iranians with a very good potential peace deal in 1982, which Iran rejected. And the war continued for another 6 years thereafter as Iran tried to achieve its ambition of actually marching into Baghdad and overthrowing the Saddam Hussein regime, which failed to do, obviously. The regime in Iran is prepared to tolerate a very, very high level of pain, and far more pain than the US is prepared to tolerate, or indeed most of the rest of the world for that matter. So that's where they have the upper hand, not on being able to produce as such. They will, when the shooting stops, they will repair things. They will obviously insist on some sort of, if not sanctions relief in law, sanctions relief de facto. Oil will flow They may well decide that they're going to levy a toll on the Strait of Hormuz, and I'm not sure who is going to be able to stop them from doing that if they decide to do that. But they will find a way of refurbishing their treasury and of rebuilding their military industrial complex. It will take time, but for them, this all comes back to survival of the regime. And if there is going to be regime change in Tehran, and I don't believe for one moment that there has been, on the understanding of that phrase which we normally use, and I'll come back to the normally in a minute, I think it's going to have to be driven internally, and I think we are still a very long way away from that. You know, I've heard people saying things which I heard them saying about North Korea after the death of Kim Il-sung in 1994. And, you know, what's changed in North Korea? What I mean by normally in the context of regime changes, I think there has been a sort of regime change, but not the sort to which Donald Trump has been referring when he says he's dealing with more rational actors there. I think what we've seen is basically the end of the power of the theocracy and power passing completely into the hands of the hardliners in the IRGC. For better or worse, and I would say almost certainly the latter. And let's keep in mind too, that whatever happens in Iran going forward will be determined in significant part by the direction which Israel takes from here on. And I would also say, don't just look at Israel-Iran, don't just look at Israel-Lebanon, which I've already mentioned, but just look at what's going on the West Bank today, quietly, while the rest of us are focused on the shooting war in the Gulf. What's going on in the West Bank is frankly horrifying.
Please, thank you very much, Alastair. Another question: what consequences do you see arise from the deteriorating debt treasury of developed markets such as US, France, and Italy for financial market stability or for the role of the dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, I'm not going to get into debt markets because I'm a political analyst, not a debt market expert. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to duck that question because anything I say could be completely wrong. The question of dollar reserve, though, I am going to address that because this is something which I get asked frequently and have been asked frequently over 25, 26 years. And I think in many respects, it is a sort of political decision. The question, but I'm going to answer it with a question, and that is, if not the dollar, then what? Because for all Xi Jinping's public utterances, 6 weeks ago now, just before National Party Congress, about using the renminbi still more in international trade, it's not freely convertible. Are the Chinese Communist Party prepared, a bunch of control freaks if ever there was one, are they prepared to make it freely convertible? Answer, not yet, and not on my time horizon. Euro, well, maybe the euro will be used increasingly, but you know, we've been saying this about the euro since whenever, 1999, and we are still largely where we are. And let's keep in mind that if we look at global reserves today, I think I'm correct in saying that something like 59% of them are still dollar denominated, which is down. It's down from something like 70% at the time of the global financial crisis. Again, I'm hoping I'm getting these figures right. You're nodding, so I'm guessing I'm more or less in the same ballpark anyway. So yes, I think there are increasing reservations about the dollar as a reserve currency. But where's the alternative? Swiss franc, far too small, far too overvalued. So my Swiss friends tell me, at least. So inevitably, the moment will come. And it may come in a different way to when we moved from sterling to dollar, gold standard to dollar, whatever you want to say, whichever you want to take. It may be that we finish up in a world, a multipolar world, with more than one global reserve currency. I offer that as a thought.
Yeah. Thank you, Alastair. We have a couple of questions. I'm not sure if one of them is geopolitics. I'll leave that one for the end because we're just approaching the end, but I'll miss this one. What do you think is the estimated recovery timeline of the oil prices post-US-Iran war? And what do you think the inflation thing, assuming here that, Angela, you're asking for the global inflation, could get as worse as it got in 2022?
The short answer to the first question is I actually have no idea at all. And I'm wondering what the questioner means by recovery time. And I'm thinking
recovery
numbers
timeline
here. Yeah. I'm thinking numbers here, because if I go back to the start of the year, my forecast for Brent crude on the 31st of December 2026 was $55 a barrel. Forget it. You know, clearly that is not going to happen. So let me just put this in context. Serious damage has been done to the world's most significant LNG plant in Qatar. So gas prices are likely to remain higher. Gas prices are not the only determinant of oil prices, but the two are obviously interrelated.
Yeah.
So the Qatar is saying 5 years to fix that plant. Now, is it 5 years? Is it not 5 years? Who knows? I suspect it will be quicker, but we're still looking at quite a long timeline. There's been quite a lot of damage to other infrastructure. Point number one. Point number two, how long is it going to be before we see traffic getting back to normal in the Strait of Hormuz? Is there going to be a $2 million tariff on every large crude carrier going in and out of the VLCC, very large crude carrier going in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, sticking $2 million on a shipment or whatever? Are we going to see Saudi Arabia resuming the unwinding of the voluntary cuts? That I doubt, in fact. I think Saudi Arabia is likely to give up its squeeze on US shale simply because it's not going to get the price down to a level where the pips are really going to be squeaking in the shale market. Are we going to see Donald Trump persuading the US majors to invest in Venezuela? I don't think that's going to happen either, but not for any particularly good reason other than lack of profitability. All other things being equal, in other words, if there'd not been a war, we'd be looking at something like 3 to 4 million barrels a day surplus on the global market today. So you've got to factor in all these imponderables. I am going to have to write something soon for Arab Digest about this. I'll see if I can persuade my friends at Arab Digest, which is a subscriber journal, to let me send you a copy. And then maybe your membership can write back to me and tell me why I'm completely wrong.
Alastair, very quick one. Any views on who's going to replace Christine Lagarde at the helm of the ECB? This is the last question. No.
Not at all. Not at all.
Alastair, thank you very much for your time. I know that you have you will produce some written notes that we can send to the membership. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and it's always going around the time. I'm sure that a lot of people have other questions to put to you. And thank you very much again. It was a pleasure to have you.
It's been a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to continuing to develop my relationship with you guys. Because I do know one thing about my association with you to date, in terms of what I learned, has been mutually beneficial. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alastair. Everyone, I just wanted to share with you, thank you very much again for your attendance. And the next webinar, we'll be publishing that next week. It will be kind of a prelude to our Congress in Ghana. So the next webinar will be on the 5th of May, on a Tuesday, 5th of May at 9:30 CT, about elevating markets, empowering people. That's the theme of our Congress in Ghana in the middle of May. So watch your emails. We'll be sending out the invitations. Alastair, thank you very much again. And it's, again, a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you, everyone, for attending. All the best.
Thank you, and good luck in Ghana.
Thank you very much. All the best.